Hello YouTube reloaders. Today I'm going to be converting this 223 brass into 300 blackout brass. This 223 brass is actually military surplus 5.56 millimeter brass. That's their designation for it. Military brass is really good stuff. It's a little thicker walled. Should make really good 300 blackout brass, but you can use range pickup brass for really cheap 300 blackout brass if you like. So I'm going to be trimming down about 4/10 of an inch off the top neck. It's quite a bit of a trim for it, so I'm going to be using a milling machine. You don't have to use a milling machine. You can use a drill press with a depth stop. You can use a lathe. You can even do it just with your regular case trimming tools, but it's very tedious. Another good option a lot of people are doing is using a Harbor Freight mini chop saw. Fits on top of your desktop, a little teeny thing, fairly inexpensive, and it just chops the necks off. Neck and shoulder down, and then you can take off from there doing what I'll be doing after this. But I'll be using the milling machine. I've got a high-speed steel end mill in the collet. Directly below that, centered underneath it, is a Lee case holder. Attached to that is a pair of vice grips to give me some torque so I can tighten it down. It makes it a little easier to torque that down. That rotates on a case lock stud. That lock stud extends down through a hole in this gray plastic base into a machining vise I have down for my milling machine. So I've just locked in the machining vise to keep it stationary while I tighten the case holder down around it to hold the brass very tightly. It's important to hold the brass really well because the first rule of machining is you can't cut it if you can't hold it. So we'll be putting a lot of torque on it when that end mill hits it. You trim very quickly, so it needs to be held in place really well. Once I take off about 4/10 of an inch off the brass, then I'm going to come over to my RCBS case prep center here, and I'm going to use two tools on there. The first one is the chamfering tool that chamfers the inside of the case necks to remove the burrs, and the second one is the deburring tool, which deburrs the outside of the case necks. That's probably an optional step because the next step after this will be going to the 300 blackout resizing die, and that'll probably do a pretty good job of cleaning up the case necks. If they got little burrs in them, it won't hurt it any. And then after that, we're going to do a final trim to the proper length and chamfer and deburr again anyway, along with using the primer pocket tool to clean out the primer pockets. There's a military crimp on there that needs to be removed so that you can insert the next primer. So I'll be using that. And then I'll also process the flash holes. The top of the flash hole tool is a drill bit that makes a nice uniform diameter flash hole, and then right below that there's a little bevel cutter that's used to put a nice beveled chamfered cut opening on the flash hole so that you get uniform powder ignition. And then there will be Lee makes a case length gauge that screws down into the Lee cutter that bottoms out on the case lock stud and gives you a nice precise trim length. So that'll be what determines the exact trim length of the 300 blackout brass. I've specially modified this cutter. You can watch in some other videos. I've modified it to work with the RCBS case prep center, so I can trim the length on here. If you really don't have an RCBS, you don't really need one. You can just use this there's a little Lee tool. The outer part of it chamfers the inside of the case necks, and then the inner part has a couple of cutters in there that do the outside of the case necks. Well, let's get started, and we'll go through a few of the details as we go. That's sort of the rough version of it right now. There's more to come. I'll load the brass. Just put a piece of brass in. Tighten down the case holder. And right now, the bottom of the end mill is an inch above where the rough cut length is going to be. So it's going to remove all the case neck, all the case shoulder, and just a little bit more brass. And on military brass, from about here up is annealed. It's a slightly darker color, a little bluish green tint to it maybe. So we're going to take off almost all of the annealed portion of that. When I did the first one of these, I gradually snuck up on the length I wanted, measuring it each time. And then once I had the actual length I wanted, then I loosened the collet to allow the end mill to slide up and down. Then I lowered the end mill down until it touched, and then I lowered it a little bit more so it would push the end mill up into the collet. And the purpose of that was I've got a handle up here that's the quill feed, and I wanted that handle on the knob to be at the 6 o'clock position. That way I can just count down 10 turns, and that lowers this 10, and I can feel the bottom very well. You know, as I come around, it bottoms out, and I only need to look at it, and I can get within a few thousandths of the proper trim depth without having a depth stop. So that's a little tip. So after you get it bottomed out to where the handle bottom is at the bottom when it's where it needs to cut, then tighten up the collet and secure the end mill, and then you're set to go. Let's go ahead and do some. You'll notice I'll come down 6/10 of an inch. It'll just start to touch, and you can hear the cutter cutting into the brass neck, and I use that as a reference point each time. That's important because if I was just counting down 10 and up 10, if I ever did 9 or 11, I could be off by 1/10 of an inch for each subsequent cut, and I don't want to do that. So by listening for it on each time, count down 6 and listen for it to hit, then I'll know that I'm where I need to be, and then I can remove 4/10 more from that point, and that'll get me the right rough trim length. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here, just starting to cut. 7, 8, 9, 10. You can tell it very quickly removed that brass. A 2 horsepower milling machine will take brass off like nothing. It's important not to reach in while the end mill's spinning down too. When it's spinning, it's very sharp. It'll cut you in a heartbeat, and you'll get blood on your brass. It's a big mess. So don't do that. Don't get hurt. Unlock it, pull it out, and then you can see I can kind of dump out a lot of the brass shavings. And it's not a bad cut. It's got a little bit of a burr right over there. But I'll go over to my RCBS Case Prep Center, chamfer, deburr, and that's really nice. That's ready to be resized and reformed into 300 blackout brass. I normally leave that RCBS running the whole time, but I won't this time, just so you can hear the narration on the video. Load up another one, go through a little more detail here. Lock it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there you go. Very nice piece of cut brass. It's a good idea to measure fairly frequently to make sure you're doing exactly what you want to do. And you can see right there, it's that's showing actually 1/1000th long. I've zeroed the calipers at the minimum trim depth that I want. So it's 1/1000th of an inch, which is not much at all, over the minimum trim depth. That's just fine. That's where I want to be. You can see the calipers are zeroed at 1.363 inches. I found that when I resize the rough cut brass in 300 blackout die, it grows about 10/1000ths of an inch. So if I trim it to 1.363 inches, it'll go to 1.373 inches. And the maximum length on 300 blackout brass is 1.368 inches. So 1.373 inches would be 5/1000ths long. And that way I can do the final trim back over here on the RCBS, over here in the trim station, at about 5/1000ths. You really want to remove as much brass as possible with the end mill, which is really fast, and not do it with do the least amount possible over here, but just enough that you're getting a nice uniform trim. So that's the basic process. Here's what you're after. That's a 300 blackout I've resized. So it's reformed the case neck. You can see there's just a very small diameter reduction there to get that 308 case neck that you want. And that's what 300 blackout brass should look like. That's been deprimed, resized, case lubes cleaned off. It's ready to be primed, and all the rest of the reloading. That's pretty much like normal reloading, so it's probably not a lot of point in going into that in the video. But I did want to show you how to do 300 blackout from 223 brass. One final thing I would recommend is get a headspace gauge. I used to think I could just measure everything with calipers. I didn't need to spend $20 on a headspace gauge, but it's really handy just to be able to drop the brass in and measure it. You can quickly see if it's trimmed to the right length, the headspace, the shoulders in the right place. It measures a whole bunch of things at once, and it's a real go, no-go, very quick, reliable way to keep a good quality control on your reloading. So it'll avoid a whole lot of problems for you, I think. So hope to see you out on the range, and good luck with your 223 brass converting it to 300 blackout.